Okay. So I run Knowledge Lab, is what we call it. It's a research center that's interested or is motivated by a handful of questions like, where does knowledge come from? What's the role of social, psychological, institutional, but also, technological, literary, topological, what's the effect of the internet on knowledge? What's the effect of the science, institutions that we know of on knowledge? I was just actually looking at my the cover article of The Economist on how science goes wrong last week. Features about 3 scholars, all of whom were participating in a research network on kind of meta-knowledge, knowledge about knowledge that we run. So we're really interested in, and then we're also interested in the kind of the science fiction of how it is that one can make knowledge better, or differently. So obviously, philosophers, historians of science, people who study, the social structure of science, have been thinking about these things for a long time. But I think what's different here is we're really kind of trying to exploit this explosion of digital information and also advances in kind of, large-scale big data analyses, machine learning technologies, crowdsourcing, all these things to do, kind of 4 things really broadly. One is really to efficiently harvest and share knowledge, from kind of expert judgments to tweets to remote sensors that people are carrying around with them in cell phones or in other ways, RDF tags, images, all kinds of places, traces of all kinds of kind of human intuition, knowledge, etc. And second, we're really interested in kind of learning how it is that knowledge is made, used, developed, forgotten. How is, what are the actual processes by which, the science that's around us, but also, common knowledge, gossip, news, where does it come from, what are its limits? Third, how can we, represent, recombine, and generate knowledge in creative and powerful ways, right? So how can, based on understanding the limits of how it is that people perform certain experimentally kind of conditions the data that comes out the other end, how can we reimagine these processes and generate hypotheses and generate experiments to kind of to test those? And then finally, how can we think, taking a step back, how can we think about knowledge generation, representation, management, and innovation practices and organizations, universities, like science funding agencies that care about these. We get 17 agencies in the U.S. government, which really almost exclusively fund basic research. Do they have an accounting or some way of kind of assessing the return on investment? No, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know how they're doing. And so we're interested in thinking deeply about that. I think there are a lot of ways in which students can get involved. We've had undergraduates involved in a number of different particular projects. We've got a small handful of postdocs who are working on projects both within Knowledge Lab and in collaboration with other scholars that are part of the broader network that we support. We have let me just mention a few projects, right? So one is Street Scope. So we're basically grabbing street view images around the US, around the world, and we're trying to do a couple things. We're trying to understand what is it that could be known, basically, about the fundamentals of neighborhoods and cities from just looking. How much can you know about, the diversity of wealth, inequality, safety, etc., just by looking? It turns out you can know a lot, right? So people can just, by tagging things, can learn a lot. In some sense, so then we're going back with machine vision tools to kind of figure out, well, what is it that they're learning, right? And what is it that they could learn, right? So there are objects that we're detecting from these images that give us actually a purchase about things that people don't notice about these things. So how can we understand what it is that people are gathering from these images, and then what is it that could be learned from these images? And that gives us, both some insight, but also a social scientific tool, right? We have the spectrum from which we can kind of imagine and map out. You can push the scenic route, right, on your Google Maps, right, as you're traveling someplace. We can really gain deep information about these places. We've got projects on the lives of concepts. How it is that certain ideas end up kind of exploding on YouTube or in the news or in science. How do we think about similarities and differences in these contexts? We're working on kind of working to develop next generation surveys and expert systems. So obviously, large scale surveys, you sit in a room or on the phone with like lots of questions. So it turns out, why don't you remember doing that? Because people hate doing surveys. It turns out, in the last 25 years, survey response rates have dropped precipitously. So how can we think about using active learning technologies to kind of create online games and other opportunities to maximize the information value of touching individuals? And the same with expert systems. How can we throw systems in a room essentially with experts that kind of maximize the information by iteratively essentially learning based on their expertise? We're playing with robotic scientists and computational creativity and generating hypotheses and then figuring out how to think about the separation of samples and kind of generating and testing hypotheses. We're also working on a project to kind of bin or rebin the areas of science for all the national agencies. So how do we think about cutting science up into methodological and topical parts so that we can start thinking about kind of getting a return on investment and creating a rational science policy. So anyway, those are things that we're doing. I think I have 30 seconds for a question, but I'll be around. So, but come chat with us. There might be something. I mean, we're interested not just in like plugging people into projects, but like in cool, new, crazy projects that kind of explore how it is that we know what the limits of knowing are, how we can do that. So, thanks.
I thought we were going to get